on this issue. For example, Professor Graham Hugo, whom many of you will probably know, he's a noted Adelaide-based demographer. He is a supporter of the need for a stable Australian population on environmental grounds, but he's also of the view that we shouldn't attempt to stabilise our population without first addressing the coming retirement of the baby boomer generation from the workforce. He's essentially of the view that if we fail to do that, we'll see very serious disruption to our society over the coming decades. And let me just put up a couple of graphs that I have borrowed from him. This is South Australia, but he says that the picture for Australia as a whole is quite similar. You can see in the middle there, let me see if I can get this working. You can see in the middle there the baby boomer bulge. And then he has this next graph, which shows the projection for South Australia in 2031. And you can see that the baby boomer bulge has moved up to here. And that's the graph that Professor Hugo uses to illustrate why he believes that we should continue to grow our population for a few decades before stabilising it. I also thought that I'd put in a more light-hearted look at the same issue. Another example of an important issue to be taken into account in a transition to a stable population in Australia's stable population is Australia's humanitarian commitment to accept refugees. As climate change begins to bite seriously in our region, it's likely to prompt significant flows of environmental refugees, which may well present a considerable challenge to the stabilisation of our population. I don't think that's a topic we can ignore. Looking beyond our borders briefly, another thing that the ACF believes should happen is that Australia should ensure that its foreign aid program strongly supports women's health, education and empowerment. Let me talk about consumption. On consumption, we believe that Australia should work to dramatically reduce its current heavy ecological footprint. And I've said they're through a major program of sustainability reform. There's obviously a great deal I could say here, but since the principal focus today is population, I won't. I do want to observe, though, that much of what needs to be achieved, although not all of it, can be achieved or could be achieved by implementing a strong climate change agenda that addresses the full range of issues associated with climate change, such as not just greenhouse gas emission reductions, but water use and biodiversity protection and so on. For example, it's clear from the science of climate change that Australia will need to reduce its emissions by 80 to 90% by 2050 and by around 30% by 2020 to get us on track. Greenhouse gas emissions make up a considerable portion of Australia's ecological footprint, so that would have a significant impact on our footprint. In South Australia, for example, greenhouse gas emissions make up about 60% of the footprint. Achieving emissions reductions targets like these won't be easy, of course. It will require a full societal shift to a low-carbon economy, energy efficiencies, renewable technologies, new fuels, the redesign of our cities, to name just a few of the inputs. But those things will be essential if we're going to have a sustainable future. I'd like to conclude by saying this, that as you can see from the various talks we've heard today, and particularly Will's just a moment ago, this century will be characterised by whether humanity is successful in being able to live within the ecological limits of planet Earth. I don't mean to sound dramatic when I say that. As far as I can tell, that's just a statement of fact. In the context of the Millennium Development Goals, I think that point is highlighted by the Asian climate change impacts that I mentioned earlier. They make it clear that without environmental sustainability, many of the Millennium Development Goals are not likely to be met, or if they are met, the gains made in achieving them are not likely to be able to be sustained in the long term. So as a consequence, in the ACF's view, climate change and environmental sustainability should be made central to Australia's foreign policy and our aid program, both in recognition of the need to achieve a healthy planet for its own sake and as an underpinning for the sustainable development needed globally. The choices we make now will determine what sort of Australia and world we pass on to future generations. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Katherine. A range of actual practical suggestions there for what Australia should be doing, and I'm sure that's going to lead to some interesting questions from our audience. We're running a little ahead of time, so we might have a little more than 10 minutes for questions. So if I could ask you to put your hand up if you'd like to ask something, Katherine.
Melinda, before we take the questions, could you ask, or could all people who ask a question give their names first,
Sure.
please?
Thank you. Katherine, I was going to say my name. It's Gordon Hocking, and I see some of my words in your slides. I was one of the 3 people who actually wrote the population policy for the Australian Conservation Foundation back in about 1993.
Yes.
Now, since then, the ACF has been very careful to make sure that the population policy stayed in the bottom drawer. And I do understand that there has been some difficulty in trotting out some of the ideas, but those ideas are sound, and that is that we do have to limit our population size in this country, as there is a need to do that in every country. I wanted to speak to you about the idea that Graham Hugo has, and you seem to endorse, that we should allow our population to increase as our baby boomers get to the end of their lives. We should allow our population to increase, I guess, so that we can maintain them in the sort of lifestyles that they've been able to enjoy during their lives as they were plundering the resources that we had in this country. Well, the problem with that is that the baby boomers have been right through all of our population cohorts, and on the way they've done very well. They started off, generally speaking, in a family which was too large, with one employed person providing the money coming into the family, and apparently we thought as a society that that was pretty good. They went to school, they built houses, they joined the workforce, and we thought that was pretty good, and they swelled the population cohort. Now they're getting near the end of their lifetimes, and they're still swelling that particular cohort, but then they pop out the end. We don't need a big base anymore. And if you bring that big base forward, all you do is produce that into the future. So I would ask you your comments on whether we should take any notice of Graham Hugo at all.
Sure. If I gave the impression that I was supporting Graham's comments, I apologise. I certainly think it's a sort of issue that should be debated. I'm not in a position to comment as an expert on whether or not he's right. But I do, the issue that he was raising was not, when I have talked to him about it, the issue that he raises is not the need to keep the baby boomer generation in the comfort to which it's become accustomed, but more to ensure that there are enough people in the workforce to support at both ends of the population the people who are not in the workforce. And he suggested that it was useful and responsible, I think he would say, to make sure that we transition to a stable population in a fashion that is not too disruptive. So I guess I don't know whether he's putting a figure. I think he's probably putting a figure of a couple of decades on his version of a transition. You may disagree with that. I think that's just the sort of debate we need to have. But I did think that the point about making sure we had a sensible transition was a reasonable one.